Welcome, everyone. There are a lot of us on here, 250 last that I just looked. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and I'm happy and grateful to join a group of Holy Cross faculty colleagues with expertise on Russia and Eastern Europe for a discussion on the war in Ukraine. As we come together, I'm aware that many students and faculty and alumni of Holy Cross have really deep connections to Ukraine and to Russia. I've spent time in Ukraine twice in the recent years in Lvov, and a few years ago on behalf of the college hosted a delegation from the Ukrainian Catholic University who came to visit and understand Holy Cross, and they're especially on my mind at the moment. Others of us, including our panelists, have even deeper personal and familial connections to Ukraine and Russia. I'd say whatever your connection is to those places, it's hard not to sense that we seem to be at one of those transformational moments in history when a whole post-World War II security apparatus built to make things like this extremely unlikely has cracked. Our panelists today have come together on really short notice, I would say about 24 hours or so, but motivated by a real sense of pain and urgency and horror about this. We're in the midst of a rapidly unfolding situation, and they're thinking in real time with us about an event that many experts apparently thought couldn't really happen. I think some of our panelists will say something about that. People thought it was maybe only a big bluff. But history doesn't always unfold as we expect. So I'm grateful to them for being willing to think online in public with us about that. I'll introduce them briefly. Amy Singleton Adams is professor of Russian studies. Nina Barzachka is assistant professor of political science. Judith Chubb is distinguished professor of ethics and society, political science, and Russian and East European studies. Dukhanova is visiting assistant professor. Dukhanova, is visiting assistant professor of Russian studies. Cynthia Hooper is associate professor of history and director of Russian and Eastern European studies. And Olga Partan is associate professor and program coordinator of Russian studies. Before they begin, though, I want to introduce President Vince Rougeau, who has been motivated by his own concern for our world and for our college. He wants to offer a few words. So, Vince?
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, especially all of those who are joining us as panelists to offer their expertise. First of all, I just want to say, our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people at this horrible moment in their history to face the crushing reality of seeing your country overrun and to recognize what that could mean for your future, your family's future, the dangers that they're facing right now. Our hearts go out to them. But it also raises, I think, an important issue about democracy in this time. And I was very touched to listen to Ukrainians on the ground last night talking about their commitment to self-determination and the preservation of their democracy, and quite frankly, their willingness to die for it, which I think just should give us all pause. They are standing in defense of their homeland and in defense of their opportunity to decide for themselves the type of government they want. Something that we often take for granted in this country, and that increasingly we see many of our fellow countrymen undermining in various ways and sort of offering alternatives that are not consistent with our traditions. So we have a moment right now to think very deeply and carefully about what we might do and how we might support our fellows in Ukraine who are facing the ultimate test. And once again, I want to thank you for showing your support and your interest in this important topic, and thank all of our experts for giving us their perspectives. So with that, let's begin.
Thank you, Vince. As everyone can see, we're in a Zoom meeting format, which is messier than we might usually do if we had a nice, clean webinar, but our panelists really wanted to make this interactive, so make it a real conversation. They're going to do some presentations out of their expertise, but you can participate by adding to the chat as you go along, and we may or may not be able to keep up with that. Otherwise, I'll ask you to raise your electronic hand when they're done if you want to ask a question. and I'll try and call on those. I'll remind you that the event is being recorded. It'll be posted on the McFarland Center website and on YouTube. So if you are asking questions, that will be out there in public. We also advertise we'll go till 4:30. Our panelists are prepared to go a little bit longer, but they're going to keep their comments to about 5 minutes. So we're going to start with Cynthia Hooper. Cynthia?
Thank you all. Thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to start things off by speaking very briefly about the crisis in Russia's relationship with Europe, the United States, and with this abstract semi-imaginary concept of the West. I think it's important to point out that even under Putin, Russia has not always been in the position it finds itself today as a Western arch enemy. There's been quite an evolution. In fact, one could make the argument that when Putin first took office in 2000, he did so determined to persuade Western leaders that Russia should be seen as part of Europe and that Russia should be included in crucial Western alliances like the European Union and NATO. Over time, obviously, this desire to be seen as part of Europe changed, in part due to continued NATO expansion, also due to Putin's very personal perception that the United States in particular was intent on helping the countries around Russia evolve in ways that encouraged Western developmental models and Western influence. You can see the shift in terms of his thinking if you look at two speeches given to commemorate the end of World War II, one in 2005 and one in 2015. In 2005, President George Bush was actually the honored guest in Moscow, and Putin's speech was very much oriented towards emphasizing the essential partnership of the United States and the Soviet Union in defeating a great villain like Hitler. Then in 2015, which was after the first big Ukrainian crisis and the annexation of Crimea, the honored guest was actually China's President Xi Jinping, and Putin used his speech to emphasize the Soviet Union's role then and Russia's role in the modern era as the leader of a different kind of alliance that didn't include the West. And he didn't mention the United States at all. And instead, he mentioned the suffering of Russia, China, India, and a number of other countries in Southeast Asia. It's interesting that in February 10th of this year, so just 2 years ago, Russia's main news network ran a very long story commemorating the 15th anniversary of a speech Putin gave in 2007 at Valdai Global Economic Forum. They called the speech, quote, "a milestone in modern history." And they cited it as a key turning point moment in Russia's relationship with the West. They said that Putin used that speech to challenge a variety of Western elites and to tell them that a unipolar world cannot be allowed. And his argument was that going forward, no one country will have sufficient military or economic resources to be able to lead alone. But he also argued that the Western liberal system, which many elites saw as the foundation of sort of a unipolar order, was fundamentally broken. He went on to say, quote, "The time is coming when without such countries as Russia, China, and some others, it will not be possible to solve global problems. New centers of power are emerging in the world. This is a reality that will have to be reckoned with." One could then, of course, make the argument that what is happening in Ukraine right now is, at least in part, an attempt to get the Western world to acknowledge the hard reality of multipolarity, and a multipolarity that would allow another big power like Russia to do something like swallow a neighboring country like Ukraine. I think just going forward, any resolution that we might find even vaguely satisfactory in this conflict is going to depend not only on how tightly the NATO alliance stands together, but it is really going to depend on how deep other countries' possible resentment of Western leadership is, and how much respect countries outside NATO have for the ideals that this Western alliance has always at least claimed to champion, and perhaps, not always walk the walk in the way it should have. I think that we are going to need to look very carefully at the words and actions of countries like India, but above all, China. And I have to say, just reading through Twitter feeds of China's foreign ministry, it's not particularly reassuring. There's not an overt condemnation of Russia, but there's certainly not an endorsement of the United States. And in fact, the last 2 weeks of tweets are filled with condemnation of NATO, criticism of US hubris, and assertions that China's claim to Taiwan is even more fundamental than Russia's to Ukraine. So I think this will be a relationship to watch in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Cynthia. Amy.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Today, I want to consider some of the real effects in real time of Putin's symbolic politics, which is something I follow in my research. It is no coincidence, it seems, that Putin chose February 21st to address the citizens of the Russian Federation to air his grievances against NATO and signal his intentions to invade Ukraine. The speech was timed 8 years to the day when Ukraine signed the 21st of February agreement with the EU that ended the Maidan revolution and set Ukraine on the path toward possible NATO membership and closer relations with Western Europe and the US. 8 years ago, a phrase Putin repeats in the February 24th address to the nation, which the Russian news keeps repeating even today, also marked the failure of Russia's robust program of soft power that aimed to maintain a pro-Russian stance in Ukraine. So what was this program? How did it fail? And how can we think about the reasons and consequences of its failure? First of all, Joseph Nye, who first coined the phrase soft power, notes that Russia interprets soft power as more closely aligned to government and national security, as well as more coercive than his original definition. Second, we should note that the Kremlin takes soft power very seriously. It backs programs like the Russian World and takes full advantage of media to promote a positive image of Russia abroad. In addition, Putin has personally and extensively engaged in soft power strategies himself. This is outlined in the Russian foreign policy concept of 2013. One of the main cultural and political instruments for Russia has been the promotion of Russia's high culture and spiritual culture abroad, especially an updated version of the doctrine of Moscow as the Third Rome, representing the capital as the spiritual and cultural center for Orthodox Christians, as well as for other conservative so-called Orthodox cultures and faiths. As a result, Putin has been able to carry out a kind of icon diplomacy in non-Orthodox countries like Kazakhstan and Syria. But he's seen the greatest effects of this strategy in countries like Ukraine, where he can more easily evoke the historical ties of culture and religion. Examples that range from 2004 to 2013 include Putin's visits to monasteries and churches with then President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, having the Russian Orthodox Church award Yanukovych for his work to strengthen Orthodoxy in Ukraine, attending the celebration of the 1025th anniversary of the founding of the Kiev Cave Monastery, where Putin remarked that the spiritual unity of Russia and Ukraine was so durable that it could only be put asunder by the power of God. Neither the state or even the church could affect that unity, which is kind of ironic. In the fall and winter of 2013, it looked like Putin had succeeded in getting Yanukovych to change the vector of relations with Europe. Ukraine suddenly refused to sign, as expected, the association agreement with the EU and maintained instead its historical ties with Russia. But Putin didn't succeed after all. This icon diplomacy failed in the face of the Maidan revolution, in the face of democracy. Because Putin's speeches this week frame Ukraine's turn to the West as a kind of betrayal of this historical spiritual unity he imagines, this failure of this icon democracy seems to be one of Putin's reasons for using military force 8 years later. This sense of betrayal may also account for the change in tone that people are noting. In the past few days, I've been thinking about the reasons for this dramatic failure of Russia's soft power efforts with Ukraine and its implications in what historically has been an important relationship with many shared borders. And I'm going to just stop there and say that I'm looking forward to today's discussion with this group as we consider Russia's tragic turn away from soft power and diplomacy to armed invasion, and how we might envision, I think it's David Petraeus says this, how this ends. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Diana.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the religious dimensions of this. It's kind of hard to avoid using certain ecclesiological jargon. So if there's anything I can define in the Q&A, I will. So in 2019, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, under the leadership of Patriarch Bartholomew, officially granted a Tomos of autocephaly to Ukraine. So this document allows Ukraine to create an Orthodox Church that is independent from the Moscow Patriarchate, under whose authority the Metropolitanate of Kiev has officially been since 1686, and with whom it has a much longer common history, as others have said. So the Tomos of autocephaly led to the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And this church is distinct from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is still very much operational in Ukraine and remains under the umbrella of the Moscow Patriarchate, the leadership structure of the Russian Orthodox Church, which also includes Belarus, among others. The Russian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate is autocephalous, meaning that it has a completely independent structure from the Ecumenical Patriarchate and a patriarch of its own at its head. The Ecumenical Patriarch is regarded as first among equals in the Eastern Orthodox world, but he is not considered to be the final authority. So while the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has special independent status within the Moscow Patriarchate, it is ultimately still subordinate to Russia. And as such, it has increasingly been seen as an agent or a tool of Russian imperialism in Ukraine. The two churches don't have too much of a remarkable theological difference. The differences are purely ecclesiological, having to do with whether or not the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has the canonical right to autocephaly as a consequence of its national independence. As such, the conflict between loyalists to Moscow and defenders of Ukrainian autocephaly has often taken the form of a proxy war. In losing this part of their canonical territory, which they don't acknowledge at all, the Russian Orthodox Church has lost a big portion of its most devout believers. Most people who call themselves Russian Orthodox in Russia are not very observant. The Ukrainian Orthodox are much more so. This in turn threatens the Moscow Patriarchate's longstanding campaign for primacy in the Orthodox world. It is also threatening, there's a fear of losing the Ukrainian Orthodox believers to Western cultural influence. Because as also others have said, the Moscow Patriarchate takes very seriously this perceived responsibility to stop the spread of liberalism in Eastern Europe. So the Moscow Patriarchate has been bleeding members to the OCU since the reception of the Tomos, but this actually began much longer ago than that. After the achievement of Ukrainian independence, there formed the Patriarchate of Kiev and also other smaller groups that broke off from the Moscow Patriarchate. This really came to a head during the events of Euromaidan in 2013 and 2014, because the clergy of the Kiev Patriarchate were vocally on the side of Ukrainian nationalism and European integration. So following that event, more and more churches of the Ukrainian-speaking population voted to transfer their parishes from Moscow Patriarchate to Kiev. The only problem was that they legally still belonged to Moscow. This resulted in a lot of violent clashes between the two groups. This violence has somewhat died down since the Tomos of Autocephaly was received. However, since Moscow refuses to acknowledge the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as legitimate, they continue to build parishes in Ukraine, new parishes to compete with the ones that have been taken over by the new Autocephalous Church. And the Moscow Patriarchate has remained firm that changes in national boundaries make no difference to the unity of the Moscow and the Kiev churches. So just as the Kremlin refuses to accept Ukraine as its own separate nation, the Moscow Patriarchate refuses to accept the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as its own separate legitimate Orthodox body. Thank you.
Thanks, Tiana. Judy. You're muted.
It was my understanding that Nina was going to
Yeah.
go before me.
So was mine, yes. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for organizing this in such a short notice. I'm going to talk about the relationship between Ukraine and the EU, and then, time permitting, about how some EU members in Central and Eastern Europe are responding to this. So first of all, a little bit of background information here. The EU has an association agreement with Ukraine signed in 2017. This agreement has created more closely integrated political and economic ties between the EU and the Ukraine. But it is important to note here that Ukraine is not a member of the EU and is not even a candidate for membership. However, the agreement was a step towards moving Ukraine closer to the West. And it was exactly this kind of EU-Ukraine association agreement which was supposed to be signed in November of 2013. But then President Yanukovych was pressured by Moscow and reneged on the signing. And that was the trigger of the Euromaidan protests and the subsequent annexation of Crimea. So how has the EU responded so far? Yesterday, they came with a declaration condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they used really strong language. But however, the focus really is going to be on sanctions, on economic sanctions. And what are those sanctions? The EU will freeze Russian assets in the bloc. It's also going to stop its banks' access to the European financial markets. And it is also targeting Russia's energy and transport sectors. And the goal there is to affect Russia's trade and manufacturing with export controls. The EU had already approved a list of sanctions on Wednesday. Those included blacklisting Russian politicians, curbing trade between the EU and the two breakaway areas that Russia recognized as independent. But then, as the invasion happened on Thursday, it introduced these new sanctions. In addition, the EU is preparing a new aid package for Ukraine, and has also promised to provide support to Moldova, which is another ex-Soviet republic.
It's 4 o'clock.
That has a pro-Western government and is at odds with Russia. And also important, EU is levying new sanctions against Belarus. However, what is missing from those sanctions? What is missing is that the European Union will stop short of cutting Russia off from the SWIFT global interbank payment system. And this is where divisions emerge between the EU member states. So we have countries like Italy, Germany, and Cyprus that prefer a more gradual approach. And then countries in Central Europe and the Baltic states who view Russia as a threat, and they want to take a much harder position. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has said that these kinds of harshest sanctions need to be preserved for a later period, later point in time. But the Baltic states are really, they very much fear for their safety, and they're really insisting on the strictest possible sanctions. And I'll just quick quote here from the Latvian Prime Minister: if Putin can attack Ukraine, it could be any other European country. The democratic ideas, if they were to get to Russia, they would overturn his government. He is fighting for power. Poland also has, together with the Baltic states, have asked for the triggering of Article 4 of NATO in response to the invasion. According to that article, parties to the treaty will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. And so that decision to invoke this article was announced by their government spokesman, and it's Poland together with the Baltic states. The response has, in Bulgaria, has been a little bit more nuanced. The Prime Minister and the President have condemned the invasion, and they did so yesterday very swiftly. But Bulgaria has historically close relationship with Russia because it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it became independent as a result of the Russian-Turkish War. Therefore, Russians are viewed as the liberators. Also, Bulgaria is East Orthodox, and therefore there is also that connection. And last but not least, Bulgaria is very much dependent on Russian natural gas. At the same time, Bulgaria is a member of the EU and a member of NATO, and therefore the official position of the government has been to side with NATO and side with the European Union. However, there are some politicians in Bulgaria who support Russia, and by and large, the public opinion in Bulgaria is divided by those who are pro-Western and those who are pro-Russian, and there's very strong pro-Russian public sentiment in Bulgaria, historically, but also recently. So what was most disturbing yesterday is that the Bulgarian defense minister and was a former presidential advisor, he actually said that the media shouldn't be using the term war, that they're like moving too fast, and that they shouldn't rush and put a tag on it, which elicited a lot of condemnation, and there have been calls for his resignation. And also there is a parliamentary party, the far-right party Revival, which is very strongly pro-Russian. And when the parliament voted to pass a resolution to condemn the invasion, this particular party voted against that resolution, and there was one member of the Bulgarian Socialist Party, which are the former communist party, the communist successor party, which historically also has strong relationship with Russia. There was one MP from their party who voted against the resolution. And historically, the Bulgarian Socialist Party has been, they have been very reluctant when it comes to imposing sanctions on Russia. And then one last thing that I'm going to mention is that this is more like a response, an example of what the public response was. There are a lot of Soviet monuments left over in Bulgaria, in like some of the major cities in the country that have never been removed. And there was a lot of controversy about what to do with these monuments. And we have seen that many of them have been like defaced and sprayed. Most notably in downtown Sofia, there is the monument of the Soviet Army, which somebody went in and painted one of the figures of that monument in blue and yellow, the Ukrainian flag colors. So definitely public opinion on the ground is very divided. And also there are politicians, there are political parties inside Bulgaria that have strong ties with Russia. And so potentially that could put Bulgaria in a very difficult position, because on one hand, we're members of NATO and European Union and have officially a very strong pro-Western orientation. But on the other hand, there is this also strong connection with Russia and dependence on Russia. Also, there's Spanish, yeah.
Thanks, Nina, very much so. Let me go back. Judy, sorry I skipped over you, but Judy?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Since it's after 4 o'clock, in the interest of time, I am going to attempt to be very brief, and then hopefully we can pursue some of these issues in the question period. What I've really been struggling with over the past several weeks is trying to understand Putin's intentions in Ukraine. And until a few days ago, I think both within Russia and outside Russia, many observers believed, and I will actually put myself in that camp, that Putin was basically a rational, pragmatic political strategist, that his primary objective was to halt further NATO expansion eastward and to reestablish a kind of buffer zone for Russia, and that the troops around Ukraine were an attempt to exercise leverage to get the West to give way on NATO expansion. Obviously, the West did not respond to that, but that's one interpretation. Then there's the interpretation, was very common in the West, that Putin's real aim was to reverse the events of 1991 and reconstitute the Soviet Union. And the third one, which I think is perhaps the most disturbing, and as I was reading the excerpts from some of his speeches from the last few days, is that this is part of a broader ideological conflict with the West that goes beyond Ukraine and goes beyond the issue of NATO expansion. So I think I want to focus on Western responses to the invasion of Ukraine, because of course, I think in most of your minds, the question is, paraphrase Lenin, what is to be done? So part of this will pick up on what Professor Barzachka said about the EU sanctions. But if you've listened to President Biden over the past couple months, he repeatedly says, we're going to have a very harsh or severe response. He said his sanctions package will cripple the Russian economy. But I think we have to look in retrospect at the impact of economic sanctions on Russia, for example, after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, and ask ourselves the question, faced with these unprecedented events and the unprecedented dangers that they pose, not just to Ukraine, but more broadly, what leverage does the West actually have to influence the behavior of Vladimir Putin? So when we look at Biden's sanctions, they're pretty much along the lines of what Professor Barzachka outlined on the part of the European Union. I think the United States and the European Union, for the moment, are in the same place. But you say, all right, we're going to have a harsh response. But first, a military response has been absolutely excluded. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. There is no legal basis for NATO troops to come in and assist the Ukraine in repelling a Russian invasion. If NATO were to become directly involved, there would be the risk of all-out war between two superpowers with nuclear weapons. And that certainly is an outcome which I think both the United States and the Europeans have gone, would like to avoid, and presumably, assuming rationality on the part of Putin, that he would also like to avoid. But then you have to ask the question, is the current response, which is limited to economic sanctions, likely to make any difference? And coming back to Professor Barzachka's comments, I think the key question and the key dilemma for the United States and the Europeans is how can we inflict severe damage on the Russian economy while limiting the harm, potential harm, to the European economies and also potentially to American consumers. So again, when we look at 2014, those sanctions had absolutely no effect on Putin's behavior. And yes, the current ones are somewhat more severe, but pretty much in the same category. Because after 2014, Putin, who I believe at that point was still a rational political strategist, took concrete measures to insulate the Russian economy from outside pressure. And therefore, the Russian economy is even less vulnerable to economic sanctions today than it was in 2014. So for example, Putin basically eliminated foreign debt. He created foreign currency reserves of $631 billion, the fourth largest foreign currency reserves in the world. This gives Russia a capacity to withstand economic sanctions for a long time. In fact, many Russian companies owned by those oligarchs who are close to Putin, who are being targeted by Western sanctions, actually benefited from those earlier sanctions because they shifted from Western imports to domestic production and have made a great deal of money in an era of economic sanctions. So when you look at this, you could say, yes, the sanctions will be damaging. Will they be crippling? Crippling enough to make Putin change his foreign policy agenda? If he's sufficiently committed to not just annex Crimea or annex those provinces in the Donbass, but to launch an all-out invasion of Ukraine, is he going to be dissuaded by these kinds of economic sanctions? I think it's questionable. And even with the economic damage, and this picks up on something that I think Professor Hooper was saying, Russia increasingly is looking east as its relationships with the West become more fraught. It's looking east, and it has an alternative to its trade relations with the United States, which in fact are quite limited, and with Europe, by turning to China. So one of the possible alternatives here, which certainly is not in the interest of the West, is not just a new economic alliance between Russia and China, but I would say potentially a new authoritarian alliance against Western liberal values. So then you say, all right, what else could be done here?
Judy, I want to just wrap up if we can.
Yeah. What would hurt Russia? The thing that would hurt Russia would be cutting off the energy exports. But Russian energy accounts for 40% of European energy. And that's where the dilemma comes, because the Europeans are caught between wanting to punish Russia, but wanting to protect their own economies. So the real sanctions that could make a difference, which would be the energy exports, I think are likely, if the West went in that direction, to divide the Europeans.
Thanks, Judy. Olga?
Thank you very much for helping organizing this conversation. And I'm going to talk today about the questions that students very frequently ask me, whether there is a position. And I'm going to talk about liberal intelligentsia and the attitude toward the war. I will try to be very brief. The Russian invasion of Ukraine caught me by surprise during the final editorial stage of my work on our project, The Intelligentsia in Russia, Myth, Mission, and Mythology, a volume that I envisioned and co-edited with Professor Forrester from Swarthmore College, and the project that is generously supported by McFarland Center. After the initial shock and disbelief, I started to search for the reaction of those who I consider to be the representative of the liberal progressive intelligentsia of the Putin era, those who are fighting for a free and democratic Russia. For those of you who are not familiar with this term, just to give a very shortened definition, intelligentsia is a word of Latin origin, but the phenomena itself is exclusively Russian. And it comes from Latin verb to understand. Contemporary Russian writer Mikhail Shishkin identified the Russian intelligentsia as, I quote, the most progressive group of the Russian population that historically would oppose the ruling class, end quote. The term underwent dramatic metamorphosis through Russian and Soviet history when intelligentsia was considered to be the crème de la crème of Russian society, the Russian national consciousness, or according to Vladimir Lenin, the excrement of the Russian nation. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 split the Russian intelligentsia into two antagonistic camps. The Russian proverb, "Tell me who your friend is, and I will tell you who you are," was rephrased and now sounds like, "Tell me who Crimea belonged to, and I will tell you who you are," reflecting the dramatic juxtaposition of those who enthusiastically support Putin's political agenda and those who are appalled by it. In our volume, we are asking a question: does the contemporary intelligentsia see opposition to the ruling class and Putin politics as prerequisite for belonging to the group? Or has political participation become so ineffective that citizens may turn back to art and literature to debate significant social issues? Can even the term progressive democratic intelligentsia refer to the present day cultural elite that actively supports Putinism? Over the last several years, the concept has undergone yet another metamorphosis. Eminent journalists, writers, and human rights activists are increasingly being declared foreign agent, iноагенты in Russian. And a 2012 law of foreign agent is also an attack on Russian civil society and democracy, giving the authorities new opportunities to prosecute political dissent. The well-known journalist Viktor Shenderovich was declared a foreign agent on December 30, 2021, and he declared, quote, "Today's meaning of the concept of foreign agent almost coincide with the concept of intelligent, a representative of intelligentsia, or a decent human being." Yet, the public statements of Russian journalists, writers, human rights activists, and even representative of pop culture who condemned this invasion of Ukraine make it very clear that this group still exists. I would like to cite in my translation something that is not available to many of you, since those statements did not become a part of a current discourse on the invasion. The statement of #1 Russian writer, Lyudmila Ulitskaya, in my translation: "The madness of one man and his loyal accomplices direct the face of the country. One can only speculate about what will be written about this historic event in the history books in 50 years. Pain, fear, and shame are the feelings of today. Boris Akunin, Russian historian and best-selling author living in exile. Until the very end, and that's echo what Judy just said about Putin as a rational political strategist. Boris Akunin. Until the very end, I could not believe that Putin would start this absurd war. And I was wrong. I always believed that reason would win the end. And I was wrong. Madness won. People are dying. Blood is shed. Russia is ruled by a mentally deranged dictator. And most of its people dutifully follows his paranoia. Maxim Galkin, the showman and the husband of the queen of Russian pop culture, Alla Pugacheva. Can't put into words what I feel. There can be no justification to war. No war, exclamation mark. And I would like to finish my talk with the citation from Alexei Navalny during his final ridiculous court affair, quote, "This war between Russia and Ukraine was unleashed to cover up the theft from Russian citizens and divert their attention from problems that exist inside the country. The war would lead to a huge number of victims, destroyed futures, and the continuation of this line of impoverishment of the citizens of Russia." Thank you very much. So now I just would like to tell you that at the current state of affairs in the world, we have a student, Teresa Esquivel, who is here and who is currently in Russia. And I would like to open our questions and our discussion with asking Teresa how she's doing and whether she, our adventurous Holy Cross student, can ask her first question. She refuses to come back. She wants to be a part of history. Teresa, where are you?
Hi everybody. It's very interesting in Russia right now. It's eerily normal. I just got out, I was just out with my friends for dinner, and we were all just kind of like, this place is crowded, everything is so normal. I don't really know what I expect Russian people to do, just stay home and cry about it or something, but it's very weird and very normal. I actually have, I picked this up a couple days ago. I had an edition of the Moscow Evening newspaper from the day after Putin made his fateful speech. In the way that Russians are framing it, I think this is the most interesting things I can add. The way that the Russian state-sponsored media is framing it is mostly it's a humanitarian reaction to Ukraine's violation of the Minsk protocols. And it's to go in and save the suffering women, children, and elderly, people that are suffering because of Ukrainian aggression. And they're just doing the best they can to make the situation normal. And that comes, of course, about 48 hours before they start shelling Kiev. So yeah, I think that's the most interesting thing I can add. I would just, oh, I did have a question to ask. Oh yes, I would just like to ask, really any of the panelists who feel that they can answer this question, what do you think, I mean, Professor Partan just said that most Russians, or she just quoted someone saying, most Russians blindly follow the paranoia. I think that's partially true. But what do you think Putin's legacy is after this? My host mom mentioned here that he wants to become Putin Veliki, like Putin the Great, and he wants to make more gains on other territories like SARS before him. So I would just like to ask, what do you guys think that the legacy of Putin is in Russia after all of this?
Teresa, that's a great question. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to go 15 seconds to that, just as if you're on the news. Cynthia.
I think that it's really amazing that a leader who has made such a point out of the Russian victory over Hitler and who has taken such offense to being compared to Hitler is now engaging in an action that can't help but invoke comparisons to Hitler's occupation of the Sudetenland or of Poland. And I actually think that there has been some kind of break, that he isn't the rational actor that we have seen for a long time, and that's part of what has led to such a surprise. I don't understand how this helps his legacy in any way at all. And if he had resigned 3 weeks ago, he would have gone down as a great leader.
Thanks. Anyone want to add to that briefly? Amy?
In 2016, on a televised geography quiz show, Putin joked that Russia's borders have no end. Everyone laughed, but I think history will show that his era has been one of expansion for Russia and also protectionism for Russia. So I think Teresa's sense is right, is he will be remembered as someone who, depending on your point of view, either restored territory or added it.
Great, thanks.
Putin's the terrible.
Would just
Let's,
add, yeah, I
Judy?
think it depends on whether you're talking about his legacy within Russia or outside. I mean, we understand what outside is, but within Russia, recent public opinion data show that until very recently, and we don't know yet how Russians are actually going to react to this, but there was great public support for his agenda, not necessarily of reconstituting the Soviet Union as such, but of restoring respect for Russia as a great power on the world stage. Now, if nothing else, he's done that.
How likely, I want to take Lily's question, is it that Ukraine will fall to Russia? What does the next steps look like to you? Do you see a long ground war? Do you see a quick victory? Anyone? Judy may be best to answer that.
Certainly, I would say militarily, the Ukrainian army, even though it is much enhanced since 2014, is not in a position over the long run to, eject the Russians. To me, and this is why I assumed up until recently that Putin would not do this if he was rational, he's going to encounter sustained guerrilla warfare on the ground, like what we saw in Chechnya, like what the Soviets saw in Afghanistan, like what the United States saw in Vietnam and Iraq. You would think that the lessons of resistance to foreign occupation are well enough known that he would think several times about this, because he can win militarily, but over the long run, gaining legitimacy and popular support in Ukraine is not going to happen.
I'll take some of the questions from the chat room, but people can also raise their hand electronically if you would like. There was a question about how this differs from the Georgian conflict more than a decade ago. So Judy has alluded to a whole range of things that that Putin might have learned from, but seems not to have. Any differences that are salient that anyone wants to bring up?
I think the difference is, and again, until a few days ago, I would have said the Georgian conflict was the evidence that Putin's ambitions were relatively restricted, because it was a similar situation. It was Russian-speaking enclaves who felt they were being repressed by the Georgian government and declared their independence. And Putin stepped in. He supported the separatists. He did not attempt to annex them to Russia, but he supported their independence. But he could easily have marched on Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and taken it, and he didn't. He was satisfied with saying, it's our responsibility to protect Russian-speaking minorities in these countries with mixed populations as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he didn't go any further. So I wasn't all that surprised to see what he did in the eastern provinces of Ukraine. But to go the step further of having an all-out invasion of Ukraine, I think is radically different from the Georgian case.
And I would like to add to this, I think one big difference is that what is happening in Ukraine, it affects directly both NATO and the European Union. And from there, there is so much more potential for escalation of conflict. So just one quick example, if one were to follow this idea that Russia should protect its minorities in other states, there are large Russian minorities in the Baltics, and that really, which are EU and NATO members. And so that there is a essentially a fault line, and that is why the Baltics are so concerned about Russia's behavior in Ukraine. So I would say one of the differences is that it affects Europe, essentially by going into Ukraine, Russia will now, depending on what happens with the conflict, but they're getting closer and closer to the EU. Romania, interestingly, has said that they would not take any military action, but they want to offer humanitarian assistance. And then the other way in which this is different from Georgia is that we've already seen refugees coming in, and most of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe are bracing themselves and setting up, logistically places where they can accommodate the refugees. So there's going to be another big refugee crisis in Europe, this time coming from the east.
Well, a couple thoughts about refugees, and I know Mark Lustow, who's on this too, has written about that in Romania too. I don't know if Mark has anything to add about that. There's a lot of expertise in the room beyond that, so I'd welcome some of those experts too. Mark, are you still there?
I am. That is really an excellent assessment so far, that Eastern Europe is currently facing another refugee crisis. And we should kind of be attentive to the broader historical and political context around this, which is that Poland and Hungary both made a name for themselves within the EU opposing the resettlement of refugees when those refugees were coming from the Middle East, from Syria, and from Iraq. And now the governments are making big noise about how excited they are to prepare for welcoming refugees from Ukraine. And there should be we should approach those announcements. We should welcome, of course, the aid that these governments are prepared to give, but then also approach them with a certain amount of skepticism and be aware that there are racial and xenophobic undertones when governments like Hungary's are saying they're excited to welcome refugees from Ukraine. Of course, these refugees are predominantly Christian and they are very much white. And Hungary was very much opposed to accepting refugees when those communities were not Christians and were not white. And so we should be very skeptical about the self-serving nature of announcements about preparing aid for refugees from Ukraine.
Thanks, Mark.
Tom,
I'll go to
can I
Munya's
just-
question. Can anyone say something about addressing the notion that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is indeed part of Putin's attempts to at reconstituting the old Soviet Union? Is this just a Western talking point or a real political imagination on the part of Putin? Cynthia?
Well, I think this goes back to Teresa's question about Putin's legacy, and I think that this sudden idea that because Putin did this incredibly, for many of us, incredibly surprising thing, that he is hell-bent on reconstituting the Soviet Empire is a little too extreme. I know that that's a line that like Baltic states in particular have been warning about, in part because they're very anxious to have public affirmations of Western support. Whether or not, though, that is his heart's desire or something, I think that he's going to run into huge problems in Ukraine. And I just wanted to say, like, I don't see how his actions are actually going to solidify his reputation even within Russia. I think that there's going to be incredible problems with first of all, managing an occupied Ukraine, like that's just insane. I mean, even if it isn't a place of guerrilla warfare, like what does that mean to permanently occupy Kiev? Like unwilling, you mean like preside over unwilling residents. It's not about like educating them in democracy with the hope that they'll become independent. This is like a permanent relationship of subjugation. What happens if he takes out Zelensky and Zelensky's family? Like, how can that ever be normalized in the European community? Like, how can we ever tolerate that or talk about partnership? And again, there's this huge question of like, what happens at home? All of the Russian emigres that I know, there's been a huge brain drain, of course. And so the young and educated people have left who can, and they're appalled, shocked. They woke up like crying and crying and crying on Thursday morning to this news. Inside Russia, it's more complicated. There are a lot of people who, you know, have a lot of sympathy for Russia claims to the Donetsk, who believe that this division of Ukraine and Russia after 1991 was top down, which it was, and artificial, which it was. But if this continues and there's like loss of life on a massive scale, and sanctions start to bite just a little, Putin has already had to arrest like over 2,000 people just in one day in protests. There's not another leader, so there's all kinds of problems about like who will lead the opposition or something. But how does he maintain control of people at home? I don't see how this ends without regime change, and I don't see how this ends without like a crazy amount of suffering for all involved. And I certainly don't think that like Putin's going to be in a position to start to take over other territories unless he just wants to do Dr. Strangelove and fire some weapons.
We were talking about from Dr. Strangelove to Judy talking about craziness. We're also at 3 levels, it seems to me. One is about rational actors, and we should read this as realists about power, or it's about reconstituting some sort of Christian New Rome, or it's about reconstituting the Soviet Union, which it seems we're turning to all of those. Nina, did you have a brief comment?
Yeah, I do. I think there is kind of another option that we need to look at, and that is the possibility of Putin essentially installing a puppet government in Ukraine, one that would be much more, aligned with Russia, and will reorient Ukraine from its Western orientation towards a more Russian orientation, which I think is a little different from what Cynthia was talking about. And so potentially Ukraine may end up looking something more like Belarus than actually being part of the some kind of a reconstituted Soviet Union. So I don't know.
Are you on the same point, or I'll turn to Milo?
So Cynthia, feel free to respond.
Oh, I just love your point. It's so sad though.
Oh,
are you on the same point or a new one?
Can I? Well, I just wanted to. I wanted to respond to that question about reconstituting the Soviet Union, but also by blending in that question of the difference between the 2008 Georgia invasion and this invasion. One of Putin's problems, or one of the problems we have understanding him, is he signals to certain audiences who understand him, but there's a lot of audience who don't pick up on his like nonverbal signaling or his symbolic signaling. But one thing that really struck me in his speech on the 24th, which is the 20-minute speech, not the hour-long speech, there was this phrase, and the way he said it was really different. He said, we will remember that, and we will never forget. What was that? And what he was talking was about the way that the US and the West / NATO used the weakness of the recently fallen Soviet Union to expand, to add 17 countries to NATO. That language echoes a famous line from an Olga Bergolts poem that's in a cemetery with 1 million Leningrad citizens buried. And it says, Никто не забыт, ничто не забыто. No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten. Putin is nothing but a Leningrader who has recent memories, personal memories of post-World War II Russia, and he mentions it a lot in his symbolic signaling. To me, that meant that he was not framing the invasion, like Judy was saying, as the protector of Russian cultural citizens in the near abroad. This is fundamentally different. He's framing it almost like a World War II moment for Russia. And he said in the same speech that the NATO encroachment is a matter of life and death. This is an existential moment for Putin. He said, it's a matter of our historical future as a people. And he also said, it's a real threat, not only to our interests, but to the existence of our state itself and its sovereignty. These are my translations. So I'm not sure he's thinking about expansion, but protection here. And I think he's understanding it that way. And we don't see it that way, of course, but it would be helpful to understand that he does. It's complicated.
Thank you. Milo?
So it may be wishful thinking on my part, but the topic of regime change in Russia seems to just keeps coming up in my mind because of the potential for body bags to start coming back to Russia, the appetite for war among Russians. I think already there are reports that Russian soldiers themselves are not truthfully very willing. And, you know, there are reports that they think it was exercises. I don't know the truth behind that. And then even just the meeting that Putin held with his national security staff, it seemed like he was forcing them into corner. And this is very much his vision. If things go wrong for Putin and in his political calculations, which also goes into the question of whether he's a realist or, actually just insane. But if things go wrong for him and there's potential for regime change, what would that potentially look like in a country that that in previous iterations during the Soviet Union, it had the Communist Party to put forth a leader. And then before that, it had the lineage of the Romanov family. Now it does, what would be next for Russia? Is there potential for democracy? Would it just be replaced with another person of his inner circle, the shoulder boards in Russia? I'm just curious about that from any of the panelists' perspective.
I think that's a great question. And I think it's one that everybody's asking because you explained it absolutely correctly. I think that there is a problem that Putin up to now has been genuinely popular in Russia. And there is a problem that he's successfully managed the media universe and the repressive apparatus such that no opposition leaders have managed to emerge who haven't suffered like the fate of Alexei Navalny, which is imprisonment. But it's also important to put out to admit that Navalny, even before he was jailed, like even after exposing Putin's palace, even after posting an investigative journalist report online that's garnered over 100 million views, I think, but he was not like that popular outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg inside Russia. So there is just a question of a leadership void and a question of also where meaningful resistance would come from. Like the population seems to be getting impatient, but they can, demonstrate, and then it's sort of an upsurge and then it kind of, fades. I mean, we saw that in these really heroic demonstrations in Belarus a while back. So I think that any replacement would be within his inner circle. And he's been very good about kind of not allowing anybody in his inner circle to really like establish too high a profile. The current prime minister is well respected, or was, amongst businessmen in the West. I think he's known as kind of like a paper pusher. He believes in like at least kind of an economic kind of legality. And but he kind of has like a drone type, personality on the Russian news, right? As kind of like, signing the documents and dotting the I's and things. So there isn't like a very big charismatic force. I mean, you'd have to look at an an oligarch or some kind of member, but I bet there's an incredible amount of kind of behind the scenes, like, you know, what do you think? What do you think? Kind of furtive whispers starting to, you know, emerge.
Thanks. One other question maybe stick to, and I want to make sure that we focus attention particular on Ukraine itself, but one of the questions was from Juliana. What is the best way individual students and Americans can support the Ukrainian people? Are there good organizations, sources to follow and support? Good media sources for this that our students should look to? Maybe if each of you would say, is there a primary source you look to aside from things that are in Russian, or where would you direct your students to look?
Well, I think the students so far have been doing a great job informing themselves, and it's really, really interesting how so many students have been pointing out to me the different postings on Instagram and Twitter, and how, you know, individuals, as they're going into subway tunnels to avoid bombings, or you know, driving in their cars, are making little videos on their phone and sending them out to relatives and putting them online. Of course, you don't know, you know, it becomes very hard again in this information war universe to know like what's fact, what's fiction, but there's certainly, I think, this grassroots effort to try to show like some very actual snippets of life on the ground. So I would say use multiple sources, be very aware that this is like a military war, but also an information war. So know where your information is coming from, if you can. But I also do think that just like sort of politically, I mean, you know, I would say, write your senators and representatives and let them know that you support tougher sanctions, and that, I mean, I think Noel's question in the chat is worth bringing up here. Like, what can we do even as a country? I think that we can say that we're prepared to like make a little sacrifice, like of our wallets, like, you know, use less gas or whatever it takes to like not normalize the current situation.
I mean, I think, again, responding both to Cynthia and Noel, that the problem is from the perspective of ordinary citizens. I can't imagine that any Western humanitarian organizations have access to Ukraine. So in terms of helping Ukrainians, I would say the best you can do is, you know, try to help Ukrainian refugees in Europe. But I think the real question is, as a government, do we have any further leverage? Because just sort of picking up where I left off in my comments, the real leverage that the West could have vis-a-vis Russia is cutting off energy exports. Oil and natural gas make up 60% of Russian foreign trade. That is excluded from any of the sanctions. So none of those sanctions touch the major source of Russian foreign trade income. They make up 30% of Russian GDP. But for reasons of how do you increase the harm on the Russian economy without increasing the harm on the Europeans, you know, hitting energy exports in the short to medium term is going to hurt the Europeans as much as it hurts the Russians, because they are highly dependent on Russian energy. And that's where the West could up the ante. But you have to say, what are the costs and the benefits in terms not just of the Russians, but of our allies? And until there are alternative energy flows. And the other piece of this is Putin's popularity for a long time depended on oil prices. Oil prices in 2019 were $53 a barrel. Today, they're $100 a barrel. This also gives Putin a huge economic lifeline, but it also means that Europeans and Americans are subject to increasing inflation in terms of fuel prices, electricity prices. And if the West tried to sanction Russian energy flows, Russia could very easily restrict those energy flows, which would further push up fuel and electricity prices and would hurt Western publics. And that's the dilemma for governments. How do you balance those two things?
And just to add to this, I think that could, in the long run, can have repercussions on domestic governments in Western countries. As people with, inflation in the United States is already being up. How are voters gonna respond in the election?
Absolutely.
Coming, and then in 2024, if they're unhappy with what's happening already, but if the fuel costs skyrocket, what does that do to American voters? So I think one thing, it's not only just about donating money or trying to help organizations that would help refugees in Europe, but it's also, we have to think as a community and as individuals, like what costs are we prepared to bear?
Yes.
So
I'm aware there are a couple of comments in there about students, having a Holy Cross student from Ukraine in the room, but sadly international students are unnoticed. Another agreeing with that. I would just say from my point of view, I think I acknowledged that in the beginning. I'm not looking to ignore students. I'm welcoming student comments. And maybe I see Noel has his hand up, but if there are students who want to add something, that's something I'd really welcome. Or if you have questions to put in about what you need from us as a faculty to help you with, I'd really like to hear those. But I do want to be clear that there's no attempt to ignore students on that. So I'd welcome that and give it a moment if someone wants to jump in before I call on Professor Carey. But is there anything students want to add about that or say that you need from us or need to hear about? I'll let you think about that for a minute, Noel.
Thanks, Tom. Just picking up on my own question in the chat. This seems to me to be a game-changing event. That is, the post-Cold War era just ended. So if we're looking to what students need, you guys, students, this is going to be your world. It's a new era. It starts today or this week. And I guess my first question is, given that Judith Chubb went down the list of all our options and eliminated all of them as leverage, and given that this is not just about Ukraine, but about the whole world changing this week, the question really is, what can we do to stop further consequences of all this? It seems to me the first point here would be what happens in the Baltics, right? In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all of which were former Soviet states, in other words, part of the Soviet Union. They weren't satellite states, they were part of the Soviet Union. So if the project is to reconstitute the Soviet Union, then those three states immediately come to mind. Then also Moldova comes to mind, which is the next state further west from the Ukraine, between Ukraine and Romania, right? And not a NATO member. So if this is simply about filling up all the buffer states between NATO and Russia, does that have consequences there? In other words, are we looking at a chain reaction? And Ukraine is just small potatoes compared to the whole scale of what happens in Europe. Any thoughts on that? Like, what do we do now to prevent those kinds of consequences several years down the road?
Well, no, if we're talking about the Baltic states are members of NATO.
Right.
So that, I don't know if it's for better or for worse, because in this situation, there is no better or worse, it's all bad. But if Russia were to make moves on the Baltic states, that would trigger the NATO obligation to intervene. But that in turn would have the potential for spiraling out of control.
And Noah, I would add that in Moldova, you have the issue of Transnistria, which is I think it was 2011. Russia I don't know, did they take a vote, or there was an agreement that Transnistria voted for independence from Moldova. It's this territory right up against Ukraine, I believe, with basically the promise of possible future accession to the Russian Federation, kind of a little echo of the NATO acknowledgement of future accession. But like Judy was pointing out, I think the narrative of Russian invasion and expansion is important to always take into account. Because if we go back to 1999 and look at Chechnya, look at the second war, which is sort of on the cusp of Putin's administrations, that narrative was, a battle against terrorism. We protested it, but I think we were able to digest it. Georgia, as Judy said, the narrative was, protecting an enclave of Russian speakers or culturally Russian people within maybe a hostile country. We were able to digest that. Transnistria, same thing. Crimea, we seem to have digested that for what it's worth, or at least it became a frozen conflict, which I thought this is what this was going to be. Ukraine 2022 just seems fundamentally different. Noel, I will agree. And it is something has shifted, but I do think it's important to keep considering that narrative. And like I said in my previous comment, I think Putin is envisioning this more in terms of World War II than the other narratives.
But just to take issue with that for a second, I completely agree with you in terms of this narrative, but Russia also up till, Sunday was promoting very strongly other kinds of narratives as well. And one was of Russia as the peacemaker and the United States as a global aggressor. And that goes back to, just echoing things that resonated really strongly in Soviet times, since that's been a key part of his politics, all the way through his 20 years in power. And another that really took off during the Trump presidency has been a narrative of Russia as a better global leader and a better diplomat and, than the United States, and able to broker agreements with North Korea, able to broker agreements in Syria. And actually you could see that as the Trump presidency went on, globally, more and more countries started saying they would prefer and have more confidence in doing agreements with Russia under Putin than working with the United States under Trump. And so that's part of what alarms me so much with this sudden change, because it feels like they had all these narrative baskets there that were actually, gaining a certain amount of plausibility around the world. And then all of a sudden they've just decided well, forget that. We're just going to go all into this military restoration thing. And I find that profoundly frightening, actually. Because I see that as
I'm
a
aware
change.
we're almost at 5 o'clock, and I want to go to 2 more student questions since we promised we'd do that and we asked for some. One of those questions asked us about the possibility of another world war. And one of them asked us about what a cyber war would be like. Anybody, maybe Judy, can you say anything to either of those questions?
Well, I would hope that as deterrence worked vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, nuclear deterrence would continue to work, because the obvious danger here is we've got 2 powers with nuclear weapons. So any war that would involve NATO would risk serious danger of escalation, which could indeed obliterate us all. But again, we would have to hope that there's a modicum of rationality, and just as nuclear deterrence worked for several decades vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, that Putin would not go that far to directly engage NATO, because he would have to understand, one would hope.
Nina, is that a response or a question?
I'm just going to add to what Judy was saying. I also hope that nuclear deterrence would prevent a major war. But I just wanted to highlight two areas where, like, worst case scenario, that where things can get really bad. One obviously is the Baltics, and the other area is Ukraine and Moldova, because it's a little known fact, but countries that are EU and NATO members, such as Bulgaria and Romania, have ethnic minorities in both Moldova and in Ukraine. So that's another area where current NATO members and the interests of current NATO members could clash potentially with interests of Russia. And so I think we need to, if we're just looking at the map of Europe, worst case scenario where the conflicts could start, we have to look at the Baltics, of course, but we also have to look at the Black Sea region.
I'm aware we're at 5 o'clock. Couple coming in. How appropriate are comparisons between Putin and Hitler? Is that disrespectful of Russian involvement in World War II, or a valid comparison to make? Maybe Diana, do you want to pick that one up?
Well, I think I'd rather let someone else take it, but I will just say that just as looking at this through a Cold War lens, or speaking about like resurrecting the Soviet Union or resurrecting the Russian Empire, these are kind of existing models that we have for understanding these conflicts, and I think it's always a little bit more nuanced than that. He
has a nickname of Putler that I see more and more in social media, but my biggest concern, I share it with my students. I'm not sure if I share it I should share it with the audience, but I try to use the words of very famous leaders, intellectual leaders. But my major concern is a psychiatrical state of Vladimir Putin's mind, because we know that COVID affected all of us, and from what we here, he has some difficult time in a certain state of germophobia and paranoia that we see in all these pictures, that he's far away from all the leaders and even from his own government. So my concern, again, I teach class on madness, and I'm not a historian. I'm a literary and cultural scholar, but my answering to Sydney's question, my only comparison is that that's just the mental state. My only fear here is the mental state of the leader of such a huge nuclear power.
And I would just jump in and say, yes, it is inappropriate to compare anyone to Hitler. And in this case, I would say anyone who withstood the invasion of Russia and World War II, or their family members did. Just know your history.
Luca, you popped in and you have a question as well, so I'm going to ask Luca to ask your question.
So I was just curious what the panelists think is going on in Chernobyl right now. I was reading earlier today that they captured the nuclear center and they were holding workers there hostage. I don't really know what the motive there is right now, other than to release radiation onto Ukraine.
No, it's to make sure that Ukraine doesn't use the materials at Chernobyl to produce a dirty bomb. That's one of the first things they did, is they secured Chernobyl. Although Zelensky is talking about going back on the Budapest Memorandum. And Cynthia, you probably know more about that.
I actually don't. I was just going to say that my brother, who is often I think that he's like kind of crackpot in his prophesyings of doom, but he pointed out like last week that something I didn't know, which is that Ukraine apparently has 4 nuclear reactors. It's not just Chernobyl, the site of the accident. And he was talking about the, need to ensure their security or at least monitor what's going on at all of them?
Great question. Any other, maybe a wrap-up question? I'm aware we extended till 5 and I know we're past that. We've had some great questions, some pretty wide-ranging discussion, and I know that I haven't been able to touch on all the questions that are in the chat. Anything urgent that you see? Does each of the panelists want to give us a brief wrap-up? Or a point that you want to leave us with that we remember?
Okay, well, back to the Russia-China relationship, I saw a question in the chat that was sort of asking if these two countries are going to act in concert against the United States, and I think that is something to watch. I will say that that China may be more than willing to like ride this conflict in the short term to maximal advantage and kind of maybe play both sides or possibly like side more with Russia. But I think ultimately there are options for like trying to pull these countries away from each other. And I think that in terms of like visions, President Xi has a vision, and it might be a vision that's like quite inimical to the way many Americans would like the world to work. But he is about slow, consistent, stable building of global power. And right now, Putin seems to be like more sort of a Hobbesian agent of chaos, and sort of interested in destabilization more than the stabilization of anything. And maybe that is linked to his mental state. There were rumors that he was like very, very ill a little over a year ago, and many people inside Russia were sort of thinking that he was going to resign. He was so sick. So who knows? Maybe he's had like a big illness, and this is like helped shift something in his mind. But right now, his emphasis on destabilization is not exactly what like China is sort of aiming towards. So I think that we should, keep an eye on that relationship in ways of maybe exploiting it for US advantage.
Judy?
I would just say again, I think it's important to look at this conflict in historical perspective. And again, this is not to justify the invasion of Ukraine, but this conflict goes back to NATO expansion and the refusal of the West to recognize that Russia had legitimate national security concerns with regard to NATO expansion. This did not start with Putin. In 1997, when NATO expansion began, Boris Yeltsin, who supposedly was the pro-Western ally of the United States, expressed opposition to NATO expansion in exactly the same terms that Putin has. And I think this is going back to the question of succession. This is a view that is widely shared amongst the Russian elite and even many people in the opposition. And this is, again, it's not to justify Putin's actions, but you have to understand where they're coming from. And I think they come from, again, from their perspective, this sense of an existential threat to Russian interests that is represented by the expansion of the NATO alliance and potentially the European Union right up to the borders of the Russian Federation. And to pose this as, this cosmic struggle between the forces of good and evil, or to compare Putin to Hitler, again, I would concur with Amy, you need to understand the historical context.
Just to add to what Judy was saying, it's Putin's actions are really pushing against NATO and EU and trying to destabilize these organizations. In the short run, there has been a very unified support. However, we do see divisions emerging even within the European Union. And so those divisions can be used by the Russians to undermine these organizations. And so that would really point towards, changing the international order and restoring Russia to its former glory and status as a superpower. And then again, that would also have domestic repercussion and in countries in Europe as well as in the United States. And so we have to be very careful when we make our political choices, when we vote, how we're going to do that, because we know that Russia has made effort to interfere in domestic elections in Central and Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in the US, as well as to influence the outcome of the Brexit referendum. So there have been this effort to destabilize democracies in the West and Central and Eastern Europe that have been ongoing for a while.
Thank you. Diana, any last thoughts?
So I'll just speak just very briefly on the religious dimension of this, which is what I'm most familiar with. And I think there's discussion of sort of how genuine is Putin's faith, in Russian Orthodoxy or whatever it is. And I think that is almost besides the point, because the religious dimension really raises the stakes of this conflict for so many people, because that religious aspect, the baptism of Rus in Kiev, really makes this something that is kind of not debatable for either side, right? So it kind of continues to go back and forth with this idea of a joint history, and it's not only a joint history, it's a joint religious and spiritual history. Even if that aspect and that discursive religious aspect doesn't raise the stakes for Russian Orthodox believers in Russia, it certainly raises the stakes for the Ukrainian Orthodox believers and really kind of throws gasoline on the fire of the tensions, not only between the autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the members of the Moscow Patriarchate, but also to a certain extent Ukrainian Catholics who uphold Ukrainian Orthodox independence. So that is an aspect to keep your eye on as well.
Thank you. Thanks for taking us back to Paul's question.
Actually, I just wanted one super quick comment to connect with what Diana said, is that the Eastern Orthodoxy is a way in which Russia has strengthened its position in the Balkans as well, historically and currently. So the Eastern Orthodox Church in Serbia, the Eastern Orthodox Church in Bulgaria, do support Russia, and that has been another way in which it has sought to strengthen its position in the Balkans in particular.
Thanks. Olga?
Yes, I just want to suggest that we, one way or another, continue to explore further this conflict, because we don't know how long it will take, and maybe invite some speakers from other institutions just to make sure that we have this kind of multifaceted approach to this problem and try to better understand. I also, so let's just consider what speakers might help us as a community to better understand what's going on. I also want to very briefly address the question of students. What can we as a community can do? I'm not ready to answer this question, but I think there are some websites where people or institution can make donation, and maybe we should consider an option of either individual or institutional donation to support Ukraine. That's all I wanted to suggest, and I think this conversation definitely should continue, because it's not only concern Russia and Ukraine, it definitely concern the world, because I agree with Noel that we woke up in a different world, and it will take a while for us as a community to understand. Plus, I really hope that, in this difficult after COVID or still during COVID time, and in addition to everything we are experiencing, we now have this world conflict. I think that we will all as a community will support each other.
Thanks. I'm amazed that 118 people have stayed with us now. We're an hour and 40 minutes now. I'm grateful to them. And I know there are some good questions in there that we couldn't come to. Cynthia, you had a great thought for closing us up that I think can help us.
Well, if there's one lesson for students here, it's like, be grateful that you live in a democracy. And right now, I mean, it is almost like I feel we are embarking in a battle, because, the systems ideals that we've taken for granted that maybe we haven't even implemented as we should have are under attack, right? And it will be your generation, unfortunately, that's already gone through so much, that is going to have to really fight for ideas of legality, equality, and fairness to like triumph around the world. And so I strongly support this lecture series coming up on how to preserve our democracy. And I think that we should all leave this thinking about, like, one way of helping in this conflict is helping think of ways to strengthen our own practice of democracy at home and our own commitment to ideals, maybe even, at sort of like the expense of our economic self-interest.
Amy and Nina, are those big wrap-up points? Okay, go ahead.
No, this is a good, thank you. That was a nice setup from Cynthia. I want to end on something that I think Father McFarland taught me many years ago. And to put it in the parlance of the times, no matter how difficult it is, we cannot cancel each other. And so I'm going to challenge our students to think about protecting democracy at home and around the world by constantly engaging with the other side. Mutuality, взаимо in Russian. When I see that, and Caroline Russell, if she's still here, she knows that that's a really good sign when you see that in Russian negotiations on the governmental level. Mutuality is so important. And I thank everyone for coming. And I'm just so thankful to be part of this community of scholars who can really think this out from all different perspectives and engage in listening, mutual discussion, mutual questioning. I feel much more hopeful than I did before we had this discussion. And I'm hoping that the powers that be in Europe and in Russia and Ukraine will talk and listen and find, that off-ramp that everyone's looking for. And I hope that we can just model that on our campus. So thank you, Tom, for hosting this.
Thanks. Thank you, Amy. Nina?
I would like to second everything that Cynthia and Amy said, is to think about what we can do to strengthen our democracy at home and to engage in mutual understanding, or at least try to understand ourselves and keep the dialogue going. I also believe that what Olga said is really important, that perhaps as the semester progresses, we should have maybe another discussion on this topic. And I also want to express thanks to everyone here on the panel and to all of our students with their really interesting questions and input. This was really it's a very nice event, and it has helped me to think through some of these problems, but also I hope it has been helpful for our students. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists, and I'm really grateful.